Before you know where you are, you know what it smells like. Scorched beans, pipe tobacco, wet wool, something underneath all of it, warm, faintly bitter, almost medicinal, that you don't have a name for yet because you have never smelled it before. The room is loud in the way that rooms are loud when everyone in them is arguing simultaneously and no one considers this unusual. The walls are brown with smoke. Newspapers and printed pamphlets are pinned near the door, some of them days old, some of them this morning, and men stand reading them before they've even found a seat, still in their coats, holding the cup they were handed at the door. The cup cost a penny. For that penny, you can stay as long as you like. There is no rank at these tables, no assigned seating by title or trade. The merchant sits next to the minister, the scientist across from the satirist. Arguments begin before introductions are finished. Someone is wrong about the orbit of Jupiter. Someone else is wrong about the devaluation of silver. Both of them will be corrected, loudly, by men who arrived an hour ago and have not yet introduced themselves. This is London. The year is somewhere between 1650 and 1750. And the room you are standing in, this noisy, smoky, penny admission room that smells of something new, is in the process of building the modern world. Nobody inside it knows that yet. That's part of what makes it work. Look closer at the room before we leave it. The ceiling is low. The windows, where there are windows, are fogged with breath and smoke, the glass greenish and thick, letting in light the color of river water. The tables are long and communal. No private booths, no curtained alcoves, no architecture of separation. You sit where there is space. The man next to you may be a physician, a poet, a ship captain just back from the Indies, a failed playwright, a successful merchant, a clergyman with heterodox opinions. He has learned to err only in certain rooms. In most of the city, these men would never share a table. Rank sorts everything in London, which church pew you occupy, which side of the street you walk on, whether you remove your hat first or wait for the other man to remove his. The coffeehouse dissolves all of that, not because it is utopian, because it is cheap. Utopia costs nothing to imagine. A penny, it turns out, is enough to temporarily suspend the social architecture of an entire civilization. The walls are covered. Not with art, with information. Printed newsletters, handwritten notices, letters pinned open so any man can read them. Shipping arrivals and departures, commodity prices, parliamentary proceedings or rumors of them, the outcome of a trial, the movements of armies in a war being fought somewhere far enough away that no one in this room is in immediate danger, which makes discussing it a pleasure rather than a terror. There is no single editor deciding what matters. Everything is pinned. The reader decides. At the far end of the room, the coffee is made in a large pot over a fire, and the boy who serves it moves quickly, refilling cups without being asked, because the agreement, unstated, universally understood, is that you have paid your penny for the room, and the coffee is what the room runs on. It is not especially good coffee. Nobody is here for the coffee. They are here for what the coffee does. And what it does, what it is doing right now in this room and in 2,000 rooms like it's scattered across London, is something that will take a century to fully understand and another 3 centuries to adequately explain. It is keeping them awake. It is keeping them sharp. It is letting them hold an argument from its premise to its conclusion without losing the thread. Without the slow blurring that sets in after the second ale, without the comfortable loosening of logic that makes a tavern conversation feel profound and leaves nothing behind in the morning. The coffeehouse is doing something unprecedented in the social history of Western civilization. It is gathering large numbers of people from different trades and classes and disciplines, and in the same room, at the same time, fully conscious and letting them talk. The results, as it turns out, will be extraordinary. To understand what the coffeehouse changed, you have to understand what it changed from. England in the early 17th century was a drinking civilization. This is not a moral observation. It is a logistical one Water was unsafe, not always, not everywhere, but often enough that the calculus was simple. If you could drink something fermented instead, you did. Ale had been the baseline social fluid of English life for centuries. Not the strong ale of celebration, but small ale, weak ale. Ale so thin, it barely registered as alcohol. Drunk with breakfast, with lunch, at the market, at the guild, at the end of the working day, throughout the working day. Children drank it. Clergymen drank it. The village meeting, the trade negotiation, the legal dispute, all of it conducted over vessels of something alcoholic, because the alternative was to drink the river. Picture a guild meeting, London, 1640. A room of 20 men, drapers, say, or coopers, or silversmiths, gathered to settle a dispute about trading terms. They have been at it since noon. It is now mid-afternoon, and on the table between them sit several emptied flagons of ale. Not because they are celebrating, because this is how meetings work. The ale arrived with the men, was poured before the first word was spoken, and has been replenished twice since. Nobody thinks of it as drinking. It is simply what you do while you talk. Watch what happens to the argument. At noon, when the men first sat down, the positions were clear. Two factions, specific grievances, particular proposals on the table, but by mid-afternoon something has softened. The edges of the disagreement have blurred. A man who came in with a firm position has forgotten, not the position exactly, but the precise sequence of reasoning that made it feel urgent. Someone makes a joke, someone else agrees with the joke, and, in agreeing, softens his posture on the underlying question, not because the joke addressed the question, but because the ale has made the warmth of agreement feel more valuable than the precision of the argument. The meeting ends eventually with something that everyone calls a resolution, and nobody can quite specify in the morning. This is not failure. This is how it was supposed to work. The ale was doing its job, smoothing the friction between men who had to live and trade together in a small city, then making disagreement tolerable, making compromise feel reasonable. It worked. Guilds functioned, trade happened, disputes were settled. The social machinery of pre-modern England ran on this chemistry, and it ran well enough for centuries that nobody had reason to question it. What nobody could see from inside it was the cost. The cost was not the hangover, though there were hangovers. The cost was not even the hours lost to foggy mornings, though there were those too. The cost was structural. It was baked into every institution that this civilization built while operating in this state. When the friction is always low, the thinking is always warm, always agreeable, always tending toward the comfortable conclusion rather than the true one. The guild meeting settles. The theological dispute softens into compromise. The scientific question gets an answer that everyone can live with, which is not always the same as the answer that is correct. A civilization that thinks together in a state of mild, continuous intoxication is a civilization that is very good at getting along and somewhat less good at being right. Nobody inside that civilization could perceive this. You cannot feel the fog if you have never stood outside it. This was Europe for most of recorded history. Comfortable, convivial, warm with ale and argument. Building things, certainly. Cathedrals, legal systems, trade networks, philosophical traditions. But building them slowly and with a remarkable tolerance for contradiction, for settled dogma, for the kind of intellectual stasis that feels, from inside, like stability, and looks, from outside, like 1,000 years of nearly the same thing. The first crack in this appeared in England, not in London, but in Oxford, and not in a grand institution, but in a single room. The year was 1650, and the man who opened England's first coffeehouse was named Jacob. He was a Jew from Crete, which made him, in Oxford in 1650, approximately as foreign as it was possible to be. Foreign by nationality, foreign by religion, foreign by trade, carrying a drink that most Englishmen had never tasted, and a business model that had no English precedent. He set up in a building on the high street, And what he was selling was not, primarily, the coffee. He was selling the room, the warmth of it, the novelty of it, the strange, bitter drink that arrived in a small cup and did something to your alertness that ale had never done. Sharpened it. Rather than softening it, pulled you forward into the conversation rather than easing you back from it. Oxford took to it. The university men came first, which was logical. They were curious by profession, cosmopolitan by aspiration, and sitting in rooms arguing was already their primary occupation. But the coffeehouse was not, crucially, a university room. Anyone could enter. The fee was the same for everyone. And what happened in those early Oxford coffeehouses was a mixing that the university itself, with its careful hierarchies and its ancient rules of precedence, had never quite managed. Scholars and merchants and clergy and tradesmen all in the same room, all buying the same cup, all subject to the same informal democracy of the argument. Anthony Wood, an Oxford antiquary who was there and wrote about it, now described the atmosphere with a kind of bewildered affection. The way the coffeehouse pulled men out of their colleges and their shops and their professional silos and deposited them in a shared space where the conversation moved faster and wider than it did anywhere else in the city. He did not entirely approve. The coffeehouse struck him as somewhat chaotic, somewhat loud, somewhat indifferent to the proper ordering of intellectual life. He was right on all three counts. That was precisely the point. Jacob was followed quickly. A man named Arthur Tilliard opened another house. Then Cirques Jobson, another foreigner, another room, another penny at the door. By the mid-1650s, Oxford had several coffeehouses, and they had already begun to develop the defining feature that would make them, eventually, a world historical. They had become the informal meeting place of the men who would found the Royal Society. Robert Boyle was there, Christopher Wren, John Wilkins, John Evelyn. These were not yet the luminaries they would become. They were young men, or middle-aged men in the early stages of careers that no one had yet recognized as consequential. They gathered in the coffeehouses because the coffeehouses were open, because they were warm, because the coffee was stimulating in a way that helped them think, and because there was no other room in Oxford where a physician and an architect and a natural philosopher and a theologian could sit together without the meeting, requiring a formal occasion and someone of sufficient rank to convene it. The coffeehouse required nothing except the penny. The conversation did the rest. This is where the Royal Society began. Not in a charter, not in a royal patent, not in a founding document. In a coffeehouse in Oxford in the early 1650s, where a group of men with incompatible professional identities sat together long enough and alertly enough to discover that they were all interested in the same questions. And then the coffeehouses reached London. The date given for London's first coffeehouse is 1652, and the man credited is Pasqua Rosé, a Greek servant who had traveled with a Turkey merchant named Daniel Edwards and learned the drink in the Levant. Edwards brought him back to London. Rosé set up in St. Michael's Alley off Cornhill and began selling coffee from a shed. The shed became a room. The room became a destination. London was not Oxford. London had 500,000 people, when the largest concentration of commerce and politics and print and ambition in the English-speaking world, a city perpetually in motion, perpetually in argument, perpetually hungry for information and novelty, and the next thing. Oxford was a university town with a university's rhythms, contemplative, seasonal, governed by terms and traditions. London was a machine, and into this machine, in 1652, came the coffeehouse. What happened next was not gradual. It was an explosion. Within a decade, there were dozens of coffeehouses in London. Within 2 decades, hundreds. By the early 18th century, estimates run to 3,000, and even that number likely understates the full extent of it, because coffeehouses opened and closed and moved and renamed themselves with a speed that made accounting difficult. 3,000 coffee houses in a city of 500,000 people, one for every 160 or so inhabitants. More coffee houses per capita than London has today, in a city 8 times smaller. The question is not why Londoners took to them. The question is what exactly they found when they arrived, and why the room itself, the specific social architecture of the penny admission coffee house, produced consequences that no one inside it could have predicted or planned. 3,000 coffee houses. Sit with that number for a moment before moving past it. London in 1700 had somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people. A vast city by the standards of the age, the largest in Northern Europe. A place of extraordinary density and noise and commerce and squalor and ambition. And threaded through it, down nearly every street that mattered, was a coffee house. One for every 200 people, roughly, if the estimates hold. More, proportionally, than the city has today. A city within a city. A parallel infrastructure of rooms that had no official status, no royal charter, no legal standing as institutions, and yet functioned, collectively, as the central nervous system of the most dynamic civilization on Earth. They were not all alike. This is the first thing to understand. The coffee house was not a type. It was a category, and within that category lived an extraordinary diversity of character, clientele, and purpose. The penny bought you entry to the room. Which room you chose told everything about who you were and what you needed. Will's Coffee House stood on the corner of Bow Street and Russell Street in Covent Garden, and it was the room where London's literary world conducted its daily arguments. John Dryden held court there for decades, literally held court, occupying a specific chair by the fire in winter and by the window in summer, a chair so associated with him that other men did not sit in it even when he was absent. Around him gathered the poets, the playwrights, the critics, the translators, the men who wrote for a living, and the men who wished they did. Alexander Pope came there as a young man, nervous and brilliant, trying to catch Dryden's eye. Jonathan Swift came and argued about everything. The conversation at Will's was not always elevated. It was frequently vicious, frequently personal, frequently more concerned with reputation than with literature. But it was alive in the way that only rooms with genuine stakes feel alive. And a good review at Will's could make a career. A savage dismissal, delivered in the right company, could end one. The literary coffee house was, among other things, the first functioning system of literary criticism in English history. Not the formal criticism of the universities with their Latin apparatus and their deference to ancient authority. Living criticism, responsive, immediate, brutal when it needed to be, conducted by men who were themselves trying to write and therefore had skin in every judgment they made. The standards that emerged from Will's and rooms like it shaped what English literature became in the 18th century more directly than any single editor or patron or institution. They emerged not from policy but from argument, repeated daily over coffee by men who had nowhere else to be. Child's Coffee House, near St. Paul's Cathedral, drew a different crowd entirely. The clergy came to Child's, bishops, deans, theologians, physicians, the men of the Royal College of Physicians who had taken to meeting there with enough regularity that Child's had effectively become their informal headquarters. The conversation at Child's was more measured than at Will's, more careful, more conscious of orthodoxy, but not therefore less consequential. Theology was not an academic exercise in early 18th century England. It was politics. The questions being argued at Child's about the nature of religious authority, about the relationship between Scripture and reason, about the proper constitution of the Church of England, were questions with direct implications for who governed the country and on what terms. Yet the coffee house didn't make these arguments safer. It made them faster. Ideas that in the previous century would have circulated through manuscripts and private letters and cautious whispers now moved through Child's in an afternoon, picked up by a dozen men, refracted and modified and carried out into the city by evening. And then there was Jonathan's. Jonathan's Coffeehouse sat in Exchange Alley in the heart of the city of London, and the men who came there were not poets or theologians. They were traders, stock jobbers, as the period called them, men who bought and sold shares in the joint stock companies that were remaking the financial architecture of England in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The East India Company, the Bank of England, the South Sea Company, before it became infamous. These were new instruments, novel financial technologies that most of the men trading them barely understood, in markets with no formal rules, no official oversight, no mechanism for price discovery except the one that happened organically, daily, in Jonathan's. What Jonathan's invented, without intending to, without anyone giving the process a name, was the market. Not the concept of trade, which was ancient. The specific mechanism of open, continuous, public price negotiation among large numbers of participants with shared access to the same information. Men would arrive at Jonathan's and immediately begin calling out prices, what they would pay, what they would sell for. Other men would respond. The price would move. Within minutes, an information that had arrived that morning from Amsterdam or Lisbon or Calcutta was being incorporated into the price of a share in a room on Exchange Alley, and everyone in the room had access to the result. This process had a name eventually. It was called a stock exchange. Jonathan's Coffeehouse was formally reconstituted as the London Stock Exchange in 1801. The building changed. The membership became restricted, the rules formalized, the penny admission replaced by a membership fee that kept out precisely the kind of men who had built the thing in the first place. But the mechanism, the open, continuous, public negotiation of price, was born in a coffeehouse. It was born from the same conditions that produced the literary criticism at Will's and the theological argument at Child's: a room, a penny, no rank at the tables, and in coffee keeping everyone sharp enough to follow the numbers. Down by the river, in a different part of the city, Edward Lloyd ran a quieter operation. Lloyd's Coffeehouse opened on Tower Street around 1688 and moved later to Lombard Street, and what made it distinctive was not the conversation, though the conversation was constant, but the information. Lloyd understood with unusual precision what his customers needed. His customers were merchants, ship owners, and the men who financed maritime trade, a community perpetually anxious about a simple question: where are the ships, and are they safe? The answer to that question in the late 17th century was extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Ships left port and vanished into months of silence, storms, pirates, navigational error, disease. Any of these could take a vessel, and then the men who had invested in its cargo had no way to know, sometimes for a year or more, whether their money was at the bottom of the ocean or about to arrive in the Thames. Lloyd solved this with information. He cultivated a network of correspondents in ports across Europe and beyond, men who would send him intelligence about ship movements, arrivals, departures, losses. He published this intelligence in a newsletter, Lloyd's News, later Lloyd's List, which he made available in the coffeehouse. Merchants who came to Lloyd's got better information than they could get anywhere else. And because they gathered in the same room with the same information, they began to do something with it. They began to price risk. A merchant with a ship at sea could sit down at Lloyd's with a man who had read the same intelligence and was willing to bet, for a premium, that the ship would arrive safely. If the ship sank, the underwriter paid. If it arrived, he kept the premium. This was not a new concept. Marine insurance had existed in various forms for centuries. What Lloyd's Coffeehouse did was create the market for it. The room, the shared information, the community of men all operating on the same data. This was the mechanism. The formal institution, Lloyd's of London, incorporated in its modern form in 1871, was simply the marble building erected over a process that had been running in a coffeehouse for nearly 2 centuries. What all of these rooms shared Wills and Childs and Jonathans and Lloyds and the 2,996 others, was a single architectural principle that no one had designed and no charter had specified. Openness. Not openness as an ideology. Openness as a price. 1 penny, and the room was yours. 1 penny, and you sat next to whoever had also paid a penny, regardless of what either of you did for a living, or who your father was, or what church you attended on Sunday. The coffee house was, in this sense, the most radically democratic institution in 17th century England. More democratic than Parliament, which was elected by a tiny fraction of the population. More democratic than the church, which sorted its members by doctrine. More democratic than the universities, which sorted by wealth and religion and gender. More democratic than the guilds, which sorted by trade. The coffee house sorted by nothing except the willingness to pay a penny and sit down. This had consequences that nobody anticipated. When you put a poet next to a merchant, next to a physician, next to a ship captain, and give them all the same cup and the same newspaper and no instruction about what to discuss, what you get is not chaos. What you get is cross-pollination. The merchant hears the physician describe a case and recognizes in it a pattern he has seen in the movement of commodity prices. The ship captain describes a coastline, and the natural philosopher at the end of the table begins to ask questions about tides. The poet listens to the theologian argue about the nature of authority and goes home and writes a satire that will be read for 300 years. None of these connections were planned. All of them were made possible by the penny. The coffee house was, in the language of a later century, a network. Not a metaphorical network, a literal one. A physical infrastructure for the transmission and recombination of information across disciplinary and social boundaries, running continuously, self-organizing, with no central authority and no agenda except the conversations that happen to begin. The Internet will eventually be described in almost exactly these terms. It will be celebrated as an unprecedented democratization of knowledge and connection. The men who built it will be hailed as visionaries. They were, in many ways, reinventing the coffee house. But this raises a question that the comparison to the Internet does not answer. Rooms had existed before. Men had gathered in them before, in taverns, in guilds, in university halls, in the courts of kings. Information had always moved between people who gathered in the same place. What was different about the coffee house? Why did this room specifically produce what it produced? The answer is not in the architecture. It is not in the newspapers on the wall. It is something older and more fundamental than either. That is where we go next. It is 7 in the morning, and 2 men are trying to solve the same problem. They are, for the purposes of this moment, identical in every way that should matter. Same education, same intelligence, same problem in front of them. A question of natural philosophy, let us say, about the relationship between the force that holds the moon in its orbit and the force that pulls an apple from a tree. The question has been circulating among England's scientific minds for years. Neither man has solved it. Both of them are going to try this morning to make progress. The first man woke up in a tavern. He slept there in a back room because the evening had gone long and the walk home had seemed, at some point after the 3rd flagon, more trouble than it was worth. He is not, by the standards of his age, a drunkard. He drank what men of his class and time drank, in the quantities they drank it, at the hours they drank it. He is simply a man of his era, living inside its chemistry. This morning, he has bread and a cup of weak ale, because that is breakfast, and he sits down with his notes and his instruments and begins to think. Watch him think. The first 10 minutes are lost to the effort of assembling himself. Finding the thread of where he was yesterday, reconstructing the logic of the argument he was building before the evening interrupted it. He has notes, but the notes are incomplete because the precision of last night's thinking did not fully survive the night. He picks up the thread eventually. He begins to work. But something in the working is slightly off. The edges of the problem are not quite sharp. The logical steps require slightly more effort than they should. The path from premise to conclusion feels slightly longer than he remembers. He works for 2 hours and produces something. It is not nothing. It may even be useful. But it does not crack the problem. He sets it aside and goes out into the day. The second man woke up in his own bed, walked 20 minutes through the city to a coffeehouse, paid his penny, and was handed a cup of coffee before he had removed his coat. He has been sitting for 40 minutes now. The coffee has done what coffee does, not dramatically, not with the violence of a stimulant, but with a quiet, insistent clarity, a sharpening of the edges of attention that is easy to miss precisely because it feels like simply being awake. He has his notes. The thread of yesterday's argument is immediately accessible. The logic intact, the sequence clear, the place where he stopped visible to him as if he had marked it with a pin. He begins to work. And what is different? What is structurally, mechanically different about this man's thinking this morning compared to the man in the tavern is not intelligence. It is duration. He can hold the problem open longer. He can follow a chain of reasoning further before it begins to slip. He can reach the end of a complex logical sequence and still remember with precision how it began. The problem he is working on requires exactly this: the ability to hold two large ideas simultaneously, to feel the shape of the relationship between them, to follow the implication of that relationship through several steps without losing either idea along the way. 2 hours in, he writes something down. It is not the final answer, but it is closer than anything written before it. He orders another cup, because he is not finished, and the room around him is loud with other men's arguments. And the noise, paradoxically, does not distract him. It energizes him, keeps the edges of his attention from softening, reminds him that thinking is not a private act, but a communal one, and that somewhere in this room there may be a man who, if told what he is working on, will say something that cracks it open entirely. This is the difference, not genius, not virtue, chemistry. The word caffeine would not exist for another century and a half. It was isolated and named by a German chemist in 1819. But the men drinking coffee in London's coffeehouses in 1680 knew, empirically and precisely, what it did. They had felt it. They had compared it consciously to the alternative, and some of them wrote about it with a directness that can still surprise. A pamphlet circulating in London in the 1660s described coffee as making men more sprightly and their thoughts more quick and piercing. Another celebrated its capacity to prevent drowsiness and make one fit for business. These are not the observations of people who have discovered a pleasant novelty. They are the observations of people who have noticed a functional difference in how they think and who are articulating it in the vocabulary available to them. The vocabulary is imprecise. The observation is not. What caffeine actually does, in the language of a science that did not yet exist, is block the receptors in the brain that receive adenosine. Adenosine is the chemical the brain accumulates over the course of a waking day, the substance that makes you progressively more tired as the hours pass, and that softens attention and slows the processing of complex information. Caffeine does not give you energy. It blocks the signal that tells you that you are running out of it. The result is sustained alertness, not the sharp, anxious alertness of fear or crisis, but a calm, extended wakefulness that allows the brain to continue operating at full capacity for longer than it otherwise would. For a man doing simple physical labor, this matters less. The work does not require the sustained maintenance of complex logical chains. For a man trying to understand the mathematics of planetary orbits or the pricing of maritime risk, or the relationship between different passages of Scripture, or the satirical possibilities of a contemporary political situation. For these men, The difference between a brain operating at full capacity and a brain operating at 80% is not marginal. It is the difference between solving the problem and not solving it. The coffeehouses put thousands of these men, the men whose work required exactly this kind of sustained cognitive performance, into the same rooms, alert, for hours at a time, every day. What did anyone think was going to happen? There was a before, and it is worth making it specific. England in the first half of the 17th century was not intellectually dormant. Francis Bacon had laid out the principles of empirical inquiry. William Harvey had described the circulation of the blood. Thomas Hobbes had written Leviathan. The intellectual tradition was alive, but it was also, by the standards of what was about to happen, slow. Ideas moved through manuscripts and private letters, through university lectures heard by small audiences, through books that took years to write and more years to find readers. The community of natural philosophers in England before the coffeehouses was real, but it was thin. A network of men who knew each other mostly by reputation, who communicated in writing across distances of miles and months, who gathered in person rarely and formally in settings. The university lecture, the royal court, the private salon, that imposed their own constraints on what could be said and by whom. The coffeehouse dissolved all of that. Not immediately, not everywhere at once, but with a speed that, looking back, is almost vertiginous. Consider what the coffeehouse actually provided that had not existed before. A place where any man of any trade could sit next to any natural philosopher and hear, in plain English rather than Latin, what that philosopher was working on. A place where the philosopher in turn could hear from the merchant what problems the market was generating that natural philosophy had not yet addressed. A place where the physician could argue with the theologian and the instrument maker could interrupt both of them, and the argument could run for 3 hours without anyone being required to defer to anyone else on grounds of rank or title. The universities had hierarchy. The royal court had hierarchy. The guilds had hierarchy. The coffeehouse had the penny and nothing else. And hierarchy, it turns out, is very bad for the generation of new ideas. Not because the people at the top of hierarchies are stupid, many of them are brilliant, but because hierarchy determines in advance whose ideas are worth hearing and whose are not. It builds the filter before the conversation begins. The coffeehouse had no filter. Anyone could speak. Anyone could be wrong and be told so immediately by someone who had no reason to defer to their social position. This is uncomfortable. It is also intellectually extraordinarily productive. There is a moment, small, easily overlooked in the sweep of what came after, that captures this mechanism with almost perfect clarity. The year is 1676. A man named John Aubrey, antiquarian gossip and one of the great recorders of his age, is sitting in a London coffeehouse when the conversation turns to a question of natural philosophy. Aubrey does not record which coffeehouse or exactly which question. What he records is the texture of the exchange, the way a merchant who had been half listening from the other end of the table interrupted the argument with an observation that none of the natural philosophers present had considered because it came from the world of trade rather than the world of science, and the two worlds in every other setting available to them never sat at the same table. The merchant's observation was, by Aubrey's account, immediately useful. It reframed the problem in a way that opened a new line of inquiry. The natural philosophers present argued about it for another hour. Aubrey does not tell us where the argument led, but he notes, with the quiet wonder of a man watching something he cannot quite name, and that this kind of exchange, this accidental collision of different kinds of knowledge in a shared room, was happening every day in dozens of coffeehouses across London, and that the men who frequented these rooms were aware, at some level, that something new was occurring. The modern age, Aubrey wrote, in a phrase that deserves more attention than it has received, hath a new commerce of ideas. He meant it literally. The coffee house was a market, not for goods, not even for money, but for ideas. And like all good markets, it worked not because anyone designed it to, but because it brought together large numbers of participants with different things to offer and let them find each other. The philosopher who understood this most clearly was not a natural philosopher, but a political one. John Locke spent time in the coffee houses. So did his ideas, circulating, being argued over, being modified by men whose names never appeared on any title page, but whose challenges and objections shaped the thinking that eventually appeared in print as the essays concerning human understanding, as the two treatises of government, as the letter concerning toleration. Locke was not simply broadcasting finished thoughts into a receptive public. He was thinking in public, using the coffee house as a laboratory, testing arguments against an audience that was smart enough and alert enough and socially varied enough to break the ones that could not hold. The ideas that came out of this process, the political authority derives from consent, that individuals have natural rights that governments cannot legitimately override, so that religious belief is a matter of private conscience rather than state compulsion. These ideas did not originate in the coffee houses. They had roots in centuries of political theology, in the arguments of the English Civil War, in the natural law tradition going back to medieval scholasticism. But they were sharpened in the coffee houses. They were stress-tested in the coffee houses. They were made precise and made public and made available to an audience that included not just other philosophers, but merchants and lawyers and journalists and clergymen in the coffee houses. And from those men, they spread into pamphlets, into newspapers, into the political arguments of the exclusion crisis and the glorious revolution, into the thinking of men in the American colonies who would, a century later, write documents that still govern nations. The coffee houses did not write the Declaration of Independence, but the Declaration of Independence is not imaginable without the world the coffee houses made. This is the thing that is hardest to see from inside any period of rapid intellectual change, the role of the infrastructure. We remember the geniuses, Newton, Locke, Wren, Halley, Boyle. We tell the history of ideas as a history of individuals, of exceptional minds producing exceptional work, as if the work emerged from the minds alone, independent of the rooms those minds sat in and the conversations those rooms made possible. This is a convenient story. It is also incomplete. Newton did not think in isolation. His correspondence was vast. His debts to other men's observations and questions were real. And the specific chain of events that produced the Principia, which we will follow in full shortly, began not in Newton's rooms at Cambridge, but in a London coffee house, in an argument between three men, one of whom then made a journey specifically to put a question to Newton that Newton had already answered but had not thought to share. The coffee house was the infrastructure. The genius was real, but genius, like coffee, needs the right conditions to produce its full effect. Put a brilliant man in a room where he only ever talks to other men exactly like him, and you get refinement. Put him in a room where he might be interrupted at any moment by a merchant who has noticed something in the movement of trade that the philosopher has not accounted for, and you get something else. You get the Enlightenment, not as a metaphor, as a mechanism. The penny bought the room provided the coffee provided the alertness multiplied across thousands of men in hundreds of rooms, across a century of daily argument, produced the modern world. It sounds too simple, but simple mechanisms run long enough and at sufficient scale produce things that are anything but simple. These rooms produced the Principia Mathematica. They produced the London Stock Exchange. They produced the Royal Society. Institutions that still exist, that still govern the financial and scientific life of the world you are living in right now. All of it came from the coffee houses. And here's the thing. Nobody planned any of it. Not one of these institutions was the result of vision or ambition or deliberate design. They were accidents. built by men who thought they were just arguing over coffee with no idea that the argument was about to become the world. Let's see exactly how. Tower Street, London, 1688. A man named Edward Lloyd has opened a coffeehouse near the river, and the men who come to it are anxious in the specific, chronic way of people whose money is at sea. Merchants, ship owners, the financiers of maritime trade. They come because Lloyd's is convenient, close to the docks, close to the people they need to talk to. And because Lloyd has done something shrewd. He has put better information on his tables than anyone else in London. Reports from ports, ship movements, arrivals, departures, losses, intelligence that his customers need and cannot easily get anywhere else. Lloyd did not know he was building the world's most important insurance market. He was trying to fill seats. Picture the problem these men were living with. A merchant in London in 1690 has put his money, his own money, borrowed money, partnership money, into a cargo aboard a ship that left the Thames 3 months ago, bound for the Levant. The ship was sound when it left. The captain was experienced, the route was established, and since the morning it sailed out of sight, the merchant has heard nothing, not a word, not a rumor, not a letter. The ship is somewhere between here and Constantinople, or it is at the bottom of the sea, and the merchant has no way to know which. This is not an unusual situation. It is the normal condition of maritime trade in this period. Ships disappear into months of silence as a matter of routine. The men who finance them learn as a professional necessity and to live with a particular kind of not knowing. The anxiety of capital committed to an outcome that is entirely beyond their control and almost entirely beyond their knowledge. They manage this anxiety badly because there is no good way to manage it. They drink, they pray, they wait. Edward Lloyd gave them something to do instead. He built an information network. He cultivated correspondence in ports across England and Europe, men in Bristol and Plymouth, in Amsterdam and Lisbon and Livorno, who would send him regular reports on ship movements, arrivals, departures, losses, strandings, vessels overdue, cargoes damaged, captains missing. He compiled this intelligence and made it available in his coffeehouse, eventually formalizing it into a publication, Lloyd's News, which first appeared in 1696 and later became Lloyd's List, which is still published today, making it one of the oldest continuously running newspapers in the world. The merchants who came to Lloyd's were therefore not sitting in ignorance. They were sitting with data, imperfect data, delayed by the speed of correspondence, incomplete in the ways that all intelligence networks are incomplete, but data nonetheless. More than they had anywhere else. More than any individual merchant could have assembled on his own. And because they were all sitting together in the same room with access to the same information, something began to happen that Lloyd had not planned and could not have predicted. They began to price the silence. A ship, 3 months out of London, bound for the Levant, not yet overdue according to Lloyd's intelligence. What is the probability that it arrives safely? A ship 6 months out, 2 months past its expected return, last reported leaving Lisbon in conditions that Lloyd's correspondents described as uncertain. What is that probability? These questions had no formal answer, but they had informal ones, and the men sitting in Lloyd's coffeehouse, day after day, with Lloyd's intelligence in front of them and years of collective experience in the maritime trade behind them, were developing, through accumulated conversation, a shared intuition about the answers. They were, without using the word, building actuarial tables in their heads. From intuition to transaction is a short step when the men with the intuition and the men with the need are sitting at the same table. A merchant who needed to sleep at night could approach a man willing to accept, for a fee, a premium, the financial risk of the voyage. If the ship arrived safely, the underwriter kept the premium. If it sank, he paid the merchant's loss. The merchant transferred his anxiety into money. The underwriter accepted money in exchange for risk he believed based on Lloyd's intelligence, was calculable. This was marine insurance. It had existed in various forms in Italian and Dutch trading cities for centuries. What Lloyd's Coffeehouse did was create the market for it, the specific social and informational infrastructure that allowed buyers and sellers of risk to find each other, agree on a price, and transact daily in large numbers. The underwriters who gathered at Lloyd's were not a corporation. They had no charter, no capital requirements, no regulatory oversight. They were men at tables making bets on ships, using shared information to price shared uncertainty. The institution that eventually emerged from this, Lloyd's of London, with its famous lutein bell and its global reach and its position at the center of the world's insurance markets, was incorporated formally in 1871. Nearly 2 centuries after Edward Lloyd started putting better shipping intelligence on his tables than anyone else in London. The marble came much later. The mechanism was built in a coffeehouse by men who were just trying to manage their anxiety about ships. Half a mile away in Exchange Alley, Jonathan's Coffeehouse was building something equally consequential with even less intention. The men who gathered at Jonathan's were stock jobbers, a word that carried in the early 18th century a freight of suspicion and contempt, because what these men did was new and not entirely understood, and therefore alarming to those who preferred the older, more legible forms of commerce. They bought and sold shares, not goods, not commodities, shares, pieces of paper representing ownership stakes in joint stock companies, whose value fluctuated with the fortunes of the enterprises they represented and with the collective assessment of those fortunes by the men in Jonathan's Coffeehouse. Watch what happened when a piece of news arrived. A messenger comes through the door at 10 in the morning. He is ridden from the docks. A ship from the East Indies has entered the Thames, a company ship, heavily laden, the cargo intact. Within 30 seconds of the messenger's arrival, a man at the nearest table has called out a price. He is offering to sell shares in the East India Company at a number that reflects what he thinks the cargo means for the company's value. Before he has finished the sentence, another man has responded, a lower number, a counteroffer. A third man, who has just read the same intelligence from a different source and has slightly different information about the cargo's composition, calls out a third number. The room absorbs all 3 figures simultaneously. The price moves. Within 10 minutes, a new consensus is formed, not because anyone decided what the shares were worth, but because dozens of men, each with partial information and individual judgment, have argued the number into a shape that reflects, imperfectly but usefully, what the ship's arrival actually means. What Jonathan's had invented, without intending to, without anyone giving the process a name, was price discovery. The mechanism by which the collective intelligence of a large number of participants, each with partial information and individual judgment, produces a price that is more accurate than any single participant's estimate. This is the foundational insight of market economics. It is also an emergent property of putting a large number of alert, informed men in the same room and letting them argue about numbers. The London Stock Exchange, formally constituted in 1801, was Jonathan's Coffeehouse with a membership fee and a building. The fee and the building came later. The mechanism came from the room. But the most consequential thing the coffeehouses produced was not an insurance market or a stock exchange. It was a book. The story of how the Principia Mathematica came to exist is, on its surface, a story about Isaac Newton, his genius, his isolation, his extraordinary capacity for sustained mathematical thought. And Newton's genius was real. Do not mistake what follows for a diminishment of it. But the story of the Principia is also, and less familiarly, a story about a bet made in a coffeehouse, a journey undertaken because of that bet, and a question asked of Newton that Newton had answered years earlier and had not bothered to tell anyone. The coffeehouse in question was unnamed in most accounts, or rather, the accounts of the period treat it as so obviously present as to require no naming, the way you do not name the heir. The date was January 1684. The three men present were Edmund Halley, Robert Hooke, and Christopher Wren. All three of them were, by this point, significant figures: Halley the astronomer, Hooke the natural philosopher and experimental scientist, Wren the architect who was rebuilding London after the Great Fire. All three of them were also, in January 1684, circling the same problem. The problem was this: if the force holding the planets in their orbits around the sun follows an inverse square law, weakening with the square of the distance, as several men had independently suspected, what shape would the orbit be? Could you derive the shape mathematically from the law? And if you could, would the derived shape match the orbits that Kepler had described from observation? Hooke claimed he had already solved it. He had been claiming this for some time. Wren was skeptical. He offered a wager, a book worth 40 shillings, now which was a meaningful sum, to whichever of them could produce a valid demonstration within 2 months. Hooke never produced it. Nobody seriously expected him to. The claim was more characteristic than the delivery. But Halley, who was younger and less certain and more genuinely curious, took the problem seriously. He thought about it for months. He could not solve it. And in August of 1684, he made a decision that changed the history of science. He traveled to Cambridge to ask Newton. The visit is one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of ideas, and it is worth slowing down inside it. Halley arrived in Cambridge and put the question to Newton directly. If the force between the sun and a planet follows an inverse square law, what curve would the planet describe in its orbit? Newton's answer was immediate: an ellipse. Halley asked how he knew. Newton said he had calculated it. Halley asked to see the calculation. Newton looked through his papers and could not find it. He had done the work years earlier, and the specific document was lost in the disorder of his study. But he offered to redo the calculation and send it. He sent it. And then, because Newton's mind, once engaged, does not stop, he kept going. The calculation became a paper. The paper became a treatise. The treatise became the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. Published in 1687, the book that established classical mechanics described the law of universal gravitation and provided the mathematical framework within which physics would operate for the next 2 centuries. Halley paid for its publication himself. The Royal Society, which should have published it, had spent its publication budget that year on a book about fish. The Principia exists because of a wager made in a coffeehouse. Because Halley, unable to solve the problem himself, traveled to Cambridge and asked a man who had solved it and forgotten to mention it. Because the culture of the coffeehouses, the habit of open argument, the willingness to put a problem on the table and let anyone take a run at it, the understanding that knowledge was not private property but communal resource, had produced in Halley the particular disposition to seek out the answer rather than concede the problem. In a different culture, a different social infrastructure, a different set of rooms, Halley might have kept the problem to himself. Hooke might have kept his claimed solution to himself. The question might have circulated in private letters for another decade. Instead, it was settled in 1687 by a book that began as a bet in a coffeehouse over coffee. The Royal Society itself, the institution that would become the model for scientific academies across the world, was by 1684 already 2 decades old, having received its royal charter in 1660. But its origins were in the coffeehouses of Oxford, as we have seen, and its working life in London was inseparable from the coffeehouse culture that surrounded it. The society had no permanent home for much of its early existence. Its members met in each other's houses, in hired rooms, and in coffeehouses. The boundary between a meeting of the Royal Society and an extended coffeehouse argument among fellows was, for much of the late 17th century, more procedural than real. This mattered. Because the Royal Society's great contribution was not any single discovery. It was the institutionalization of a method. The idea that knowledge claims should be tested by experiment and observation, that results should be communicated openly and subjected to challenge, that the authority of a proposition derived from the evidence behind it rather than the status of the person asserting it. These principles, which now seem obvious, were radical in the 17th century. And they were radical in exactly the way that the coffeehouse was radical. They were anti-hierarchical. They insisted that the question mattered more than the questioner. The Royal Society formalized this insistence, put it in a charter, gave it a Latin motto, nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. That was, essentially, the motto of every coffeehouse argument that had preceded it. The coffeehouses had been practicing this epistemology for years before the Royal Society named it. The Society took the practice and made it permanent. And then, eventually, it moved into a building, got a president, developed procedures, began slowly and inevitably to sort its members by reputation and achievement rather than admitting anyone who paid a penny and wanted to argue. The institution survived. The openness did not quite. But by then, the Principia was written, the insurance market was running, the stock exchange was pricing shares, the work was done, the rooms had done their job, the world they made was already irreversible. And somewhere in Whitehall, a king who had spent his childhood watching a revolution destroy his family was reading the reports his informers brought him from these rooms, and deciding that irreversible was not a word he was prepared to accept. Charles II had survived things that would have broken most men. He had watched his father walk to a scaffold in Whitehall on a January morning in 1649 and place his head on a block, and he had lived with that image for 11 years of exile, in France, in the Spanish Netherlands, in the courts of Catholic Europe, moving from patron to patron, king without a kingdom, dependent on the charity of foreign monarchs who found him useful as a symbol and inconvenient as a houseguest. He had fought a battle at Worcester in 1651, been routed, hidden in an oak tree while parliamentary soldiers searched the woods beneath him, and spent 6 weeks in disguise, moving through a country where the price on his head was £1,000. He had survived all of it. And in 1660, when England decided it was tired of the Republic and invited him home, he had walked back into London through crowds so thick and so loud that the diarist John Evelyn wrote that he could not believe it was the same nation that had cut off his father's head. Charles understood power with the particular clarity of a man who had lost it and recovered it by luck and patience and the slow exhaustion of his enemies. He understood that power was not simply military or legal. It was informational. It depended on controlling what people knew, what they said, what narratives circulated about the legitimacy of the men who governed them. His father had lost control of that narrative, and Charles was determined not to repeat the mistake. The coffeehouses were, from this perspective, a problem. They had been a problem for years, but by 1675, they had become an urgent one. To understand why 1675 specifically, you need to understand the political weather of that moment. England in the mid-1670s was in the early stages of a constitutional crisis that would, within a decade, produce the Glorious Revolution and permanently alter the relationship between the Crown and Parliament. At the center of the crisis was a question that everyone was asking, and nobody was supposed to be asking aloud. What happens if Charles dies without a legitimate heir, and his brother James, openly Catholic, married to a Catholic, surrounded by Catholic advisors, becomes King of England? The question was not academic. Charles had no legitimate children. James was next in line. And James's Catholicism was not a private matter of conscience, but a political fact of the first order, in a country where anti-Catholic feeling ran so deep and so hot that it regularly produced mass hysteria. Within 3 years, a man named Titus Oates would fabricate an entirely fictional popish plot to assassinate the king, and the fabrication would be believed so completely that 15 innocent men would be executed before the lie collapsed. In this atmosphere, the coffeehouses were doing what the coffeehouses always did. They were talking. Men were discussing the succession. Men were discussing the constitutional implications of a Catholic monarch. Men were reading and debating the pamphlets of the emerging Whig movement, writers like Andrew Marvell and later John Locke, who were developing in print and in coffeehouse argument a theory of political authority that placed consent above inheritance and made the legitimacy of a king contingent on something other than his bloodline. This was, from Charles's perspective, sedition. Conducted openly, daily. In 3,000 rooms he could not easily police. He had tried to police them. The government had embedded informers in the coffeehouses for years, men paid to sit and listen and report back on what was being said. The reports survive in the state papers, and they are a remarkable document of official anxiety. The informers recorded arguments about the succession, about the king's foreign policy, about his relationship with Louis XIV of France, about the standing army, about the independence of Parliament. They recorded, with evident alarm, as the speed at which a pamphlet published in the morning could be read, argued over, and synthesized into collective opinion by the afternoon. They recorded the names of men who said things that the government found threatening, though the government rarely acted on these names, because acting on them would have required acknowledging the scale of the problem. The coffeehouses were not a conspiracy. That was what made them so difficult to suppress. A conspiracy has leaders you can arrest and a structure you can dismantle. The coffeehouses had neither. They were a network, distributed, self-organizing, with no central node whose removal would collapse the whole. Every attempt to identify and silence the most dangerous voices simply dispersed the conversation into other rooms, other tables. Other men who had been listening and were now ready to speak. Charles understood this. His advisors understood it. And in December of 1675, they decided that the only solution was to eliminate the network entirely. The proclamation for the suppression of coffeehouses went out on the 17th of December, 1675. The language was careful and the reasoning was specific. The coffeehouses had become, the proclamation declared, the great resort of idle and disaffected persons, where men of inferior rank spread false, malicious, and scandalous reports that tended to the defamation of His Majesty's government and to the disturbance of the peace and quiet of the realm. All keepers of coffeehouses were commanded to close their establishments by the 10th of January, 1676. Licenses would not be renewed. The coffeehouses were finished. The reaction was immediate, and it was not what Charles had anticipated. It was not riot. It was not organized resistance. It was something quieter, and for a king, more alarming. It was universal, contemptuous, and completely determined refusal. The merchants, who had been pricing risk at Lloyd's for a decade, were not going to give up their market because a proclamation said so. The traders at Jonathan's were not going to stop trading. The physicians at Child's, the poets at Will's, the natural philosophers who had no other room in which to conduct the informal business of English science, none of them were going to disappear because Charles Stuart had decided they were inconvenient. Petitions arrived at court within days, not from radicals, not from known dissidents, but from the respectable middle of English commercial and professional life, the men whose cooperation Charles needed to govern. The petitions were polite in their language and absolute in their position. The coffeehouses were necessary to the conduct of trade, to the circulation of legitimate news, to the professional lives of thousands of men who had built their working routines around them. Closing them was not a political act against sedition. It was an economic act against commerce, and England's commercial class, which had been growing in wealth and confidence throughout the 17th century, had developed, in the coffeehouses themselves, precisely the collective identity and communicative capacity needed to say so loudly, in unison. Charles lasted 11 days. On the 8th of January, 1676, 2 days before the deadline he had set, he issued a retraction. The coffeehouses could remain open. The proclamation was effectively void. The licenses would continue. The king, who had outwitted parliamentarian soldiers in an oak tree, who had waited 11 years in exile for his moment and taken it with perfect timing, who was widely regarded as the most politically intelligent monarch England had produced in a century, this man had been defeated in 11 days by the combined refusal of London's coffee drinkers to give up their rooms. The retraction was dressed in the language of royal magnanimity. Charles was pleased to extend his grace to his subjects, to allow the coffeehouses to continue under conditions of renewed responsibility, to trust in the loyalty of the men who frequented them. The language of grace was the only face-saving option available. The reality was a climb down so complete that the subject was never raised again. No subsequent attempt was made to suppress the coffeehouses. They continued to operate, to expand, to talk about the succession, about Parliament, about the emerging Whig theory of government that would, within 13 years, produce the glorious revolution that effectively ended the divine right of English kings. Charles had tried to silence the conversation. The conversation continued, and the ideas being argued in those rooms outlasted him, outlasted his brother James, outlasted the political world that had found them threatening. There is something worth sitting with in the specific nature of Charles's defeat. Picture the men who broke him. Not the leaders of a movement. There were no leaders. Not the organizers of a campaign. There was no campaign. There was a merchant in Cornhill who read the proclamation and told his neighbor it was intolerable. A physician at Child's who said the same thing to the clergyman across the table. A natural philosopher who wrote a letter. A lawyer who wrote a petition. A journalist who printed something. None of them knew the others were doing it. None of them needed to, because the coffeehouses had already done the organizing, had already built, over 20 years of daily argument, a community of men who thought of public affairs as their business, who had developed the habit of collective opinion, who understood without being told. See that a thing said loudly enough in enough rooms at the same time became a force that a king could not easily ignore. This was new. Not the opposition to royal power. That was ancient. What was new was the infrastructure of the opposition, the speed of it, the distributedness of it, the fact that it required no single leader to arrest, no single pamphlet to suppress, no single room to close. It was everywhere the coffeehouses were, which was everywhere that mattered, which was the whole of London's commercial and intellectual life. A space had opened up in England between the king and the individual subject, not a legal space. Parliament had existed for centuries and had managed that negotiation badly enough to produce a civil war. A social space. A space filled with argument and print and coffee and the daily practice of men reasoning together about how they were governed and on what terms. This space, once opened, could not be closed. Charles tried. He had 11 days. The coffeehouses did not cause the glorious revolution of 1688, which would permanently curtail the power of the English crown. But the men who made that revolution, who argued its necessity, who built its consensus, who drafted its terms, had been educated in the coffeehouses, had learned in the coffeehouses that collective reasoning was possible and that its conclusions had force. The revolution was the coffeehouses thinking out loud at sufficient volume for sufficient years that the thinking eventually became fact. Some things once begun cannot be stopped by the men who find them inconvenient, not even kings. But the coffeehouses had won on a specific and limited terms. The rooms were open. The argument was free. Any man who paid his penny could walk in and speak and be heard. Any man. That word had been sitting in the middle of this story from the beginning, unremarked, unchallenged, as invisible to the men inside the rooms as the smell of the coffee they had stopped noticing. Outside those rooms, half of London had been listening to the argument through the walls, and some of them had decided they had something to say about it. In 1674, the women of England published a petition. It was called the Women's Petition Against Coffee, and it was addressed to the Right Honorable, the Keepers of the Liberty of Venus. And it argued, now with a comic fury that managed to be both entirely serious and entirely aware of its own absurdity, that coffee had made Englishmen useless, not politically useless, not intellectually useless, useless in the specific domestic, marital sense that the women of England found most immediately relevant to their daily lives. The petition's argument ran as follows. Before coffee, an Englishman came home from his work in a state of warm, ale-softened availability, tired perhaps, but present, convivial, inclined toward the domestic pleasures that marriage was supposed to provide. After coffee, he went to the coffeehouse instead. He sat there for hours, alert and argumentative and completely absorbed in conversations that had nothing to do with his wife or his household. He came home late, overstimulated, and his mind still running on the last 3 arguments he had lost at the coffeehouse table, incapable of the relaxed, attentive domesticity that his wife had a reasonable right to expect. And the petition's most pointed complaint, delivered with a precision that leaves little to the imagination, coffee had made him, in the most physical sense, less of a husband than he had been before. The petition described coffee as making men as unfruitful as the deserts whence that unhappy berry is said to be brought. It complained that the coffeehouse had eunuched our husbands and rendered the marriage bed a place of conversation rather than its proper purpose. It demanded, with an earnestness that may or may not have been entirely satirical, coffee be banned and Englishmen return to the ale-warmed availability their wives remembered and preferred. The petition was almost certainly written by a man. This is the first complication, and it is worth sitting with. The voice is too knowing, the comic timing too precise, the targets too accurately chosen for the document to be entirely innocent of satire. Several historians have argued that it was a pamphlet written to mock both the coffeehouses and the women who resented them. A joke at everyone's expense, dressed in the language of female complaint to make it publishable and deniable. The men's response, published shortly after under the title The Men's Answer to the Women's Petition Against Coffee, has the quality of a setup receiving its punchline. But the joke, if it was a joke, this contained a truth that nobody was laughing about. The coffeehouses excluded women, not by royal decree, not by any law or charter, but by the overwhelming force of social convention, the same convention that excluded women from universities, from guilds, from parliament, from the learned professions, from almost every space where the serious business of intellectual and commercial life was conducted. The penny bought any man entry to the room. It did not buy a woman entry to the room. Women ran coffeehouses. Many of the establishments were operated by women who served the coffee and managed the premises and heard every argument conducted within their walls. But they did not sit at the tables. They did not participate in the conversations. They were the infrastructure of the network, not its nodes. Picture a woman in London in 1690. Call her Mary, because that was the most common name, because she is not a specific person, but she stood in for thousands of them. Mary's husband is a physician. He leaves the house each morning and goes to Child's Coffeehouse near St. Paul's, where he sits with other physicians and theologians and argues about the nature of the soul, the evidence for and against various medical theories, the political implications of the latest pamphlet from Amsterdam. He comes home in the evening with his mind sharpened and his opinions refined and his professional network expanded by another day of exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary conversation that the coffeehouse made uniquely possible. Mary does not go to Child's. She has never been inside Child's. She manages the household, raises the children, receives visitors in the parlor, reads what books she can obtain, and thinks. Because Mary is intelligent, because intelligence is not a male characteristic despite what the architecture of her world implies. About exactly the same questions her husband is arguing about in the coffeehouse. She has opinions about the nature of the soul. She has read enough to have something worth saying about the medical theories. But there is no room for her to say it. Not the coffeehouse, not the university, not the Royal Society, which does not admit women. The parlor, where the conversation is domestic, the church, where the conversation is prescribed, everywhere else, the door. Mary knows because she is not stupid, in that the world being built in the coffeehouses, the world of open argument and free inquiry, and the radical proposition that any idea should be testable by any intelligent person, does not in practice include her. The penny university charges a penny. It just doesn't sell tickets to women. Consider what John Locke was writing in the same years that Mary stood outside Child's. Locke was arguing, in the coffeehouses, in correspondence, eventually in print, that political authority derives from consent, that no man is bound by a government he did not, in some meaningful sense, agree to, that the rights of individuals are not gifts from kings, but properties of persons, inherent, inalienable, prior to any political arrangement. These were radical ideas. They were also, if you followed them honestly, ideas with an obvious implication that Locke did not follow. If authority requires consent and rights belong to persons, and persons include women, then what exactly is the justification for Mary standing outside the door? Locke did not ask this question. He came close enough to it that the question is visible in the gaps of his argument, but he did not ask it. He went home from the coffeehouse, where he had argued for the natural equality of rational beings, and he did not apply that argument to the woman who had managed his household while he argued. Newton reformed the understanding of the physical universe and spent 24 years as president of the Royal Society without once raising the question of why women could not be fellows. The men who built the public sphere, who fought Charles II for the right to argue freely, who insisted that no authority could silence legitimate inquiry, drew the boundary of legitimate inquiry at the door of the room they argued in, and most of them never noticed the drawing. Mary Astle noticed. In 1694, she published A Serious Proposal to the Ladies, a call for the establishment of a women's college, a place where women could receive the rigorous intellectual education that men received at the universities and conducted informally in the coffeehouses. The proposal was specific, practical, and carefully argued. It was also, in the intellectual culture of the period, essentially invisible. The same journals that debated Locke's political philosophy and Newton's mathematics found Astell's proposal either amusing or irrelevant. The Spectator, and which had dedicated itself to bringing Enlightenment values to the widest possible audience, published pieces mocking women's intellectual pretensions alongside pieces celebrating the life of the mind. This was not incidental. It was structural. And the structure had consequences that ran forward into everything the Enlightenment produced. Consequences that took another 2 centuries to begin to address, and that are not fully addressed yet. The penny university had a scholarship it did not offer. The most radical democratic institution in 17th century England drew its democracy at the door, and half the population stood outside it. The women's petition against coffee did not change this. It was not meant to. Or, if it was, it failed entirely. The coffeehouses continued to exclude women. The Enlightenment continued to be conducted by men in rooms women could not enter, producing ideas about universal human reason that did not, in practice, apply universally. But the petition survives. As a document, as a joke, as a piece of evidence about the texture of life in this period, it survives. And what it tells us, read carefully, is that the women of England were not unaware of what was happening in those rooms. They knew. They felt the exclusion with a specificity that the petition captures, even through its comic register. The frustration of watching your husband disappear daily into a world of ideas and argument and connection, and being handed, in exchange, the management of a household and the company of your own thoughts. The coffeehouse gave England the Enlightenment. It gave it to half of England's population. The other half watched from outside, and some of them wrote about it, and their writing was turned into a joke, and the joke was published, and everyone laughed, and the coffeehouses continued. This, too, is part of the story. Not a detour from it. The limit of the Penny University is not a footnote to its achievement. It is the shape of the achievement, brilliant and incomplete, generous and exclusive, world-changing, and, in this one respect, stubbornly, deliberately small. And yet, for the men it did admit, what it gave them was something no institution in human history had quite managed before. Not just a room, not just a cup, a network, alive, global, running in real time, that put a merchant in London closer to the news from Constantinople than a king had been a century earlier. The coffeehouses were not only building institutions, they were building something that made those institutions possible in the first place, an information system, the first of its kind, and it was moving faster than anyone inside it fully understood. On the morning of the 14th of September 1702, a merchant sitting in Lloyd's Coffeehouse on Lombard Street read, in the pages of a newsletter pinned to the wall, that a Dutch fleet had been intercepted off the coast of Vigo Bay in northwestern Spain. The English and Dutch had attacked a Spanish treasure fleet and its French escort. The battle had been decisive. 12 Spanish galleons captured, 11 French warships taken or destroyed. The treasure, silver from the Americas bound for Madrid, was either seized or sunk, depending on which account you trusted. The merchant read this and immediately began to calculate. The news was 11 days old by the time it reached him. 11 days for a courier to ride from Vigo to a port, board a packet boat, cross the channel, ride to London, deliver the report to Lloyd's correspondent, who transcribed it and sent it to Lombard Street, where it was copied and pinned to the wall before the morning's first customers arrived. 11 days. In the context of the 17th century, this was extraordinary speed. A generation earlier, the same news might have taken 3 weeks. A generation before that, a month or more. The merchant was not thinking about the speed. He was thinking about what the news meant for the price of Spanish silver, for the insurance rates on the Atlantic routes, for the companies he held shares in, for the men he was meeting that afternoon at Jonathan's. He was thinking, in other words, with information. Current information, specific information. The kind of information that, in a world running on slower news, would have been available only to a king's ministers and the agents of great trading houses. He was sitting in a coffeehouse. He had paid a penny. The coffeehouses were, by the early 18th century, the fastest information network in the world. This requires some unpacking, because the word network carries connotations that belong to a later age. Connotations of design, of intentional architecture, of systems built to do what they do. The Coffeehouse Information Network was none of these things. It was emergent. It grew from the same accidental logic that produced everything else the coffeehouses generated. Put large numbers of people with different kinds of knowledge in the same room, give them a reason to share what they know, and watch what happens. What happened over the course of half a century was the construction of an information infrastructure of extraordinary reach and speed. At its center were the coffeehouses themselves, the physical nodes where information arrived, was read, was argued over, was synthesized, and was redistributed. Around them were the networks of correspondence that coffeehouses like Lloyd's had cultivated in ports and capitals across Europe and beyond. Between them moved the newsletters and papers that had been born in the coffeehouses and that carried, from room to room and city to city, the daily output of London's collective intelligence. The newsletter that carried the news of Vigo Bay to Lloyd's was part of a broader ecosystem of print that the coffeehouses had generated and sustained. England's first daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, appeared in 1702, the same year as Vigo Bay, and it was written, distributed, and primarily read in coffeehouses. Before it, and alongside it, ran a proliferating series of newsletters, price lists, parliamentary reports, and foreign intelligence sheets, all of them products of the same culture of information hunger that the coffeehouses had created and fed. Two publications deserve particular attention because they were not merely products of the coffeehouse culture. They were, in a precise sense, its self-portrait. The Tatler began publication in 1709, written by Richard Steele under the pseudonym Isaac Bickerstaff. It was explicitly organized around the coffeehouses. Different sections of each issue were headed with the names of the coffeehouses from which the relevant news or commentary supposedly originated. Foreign and domestic news from St. James's Coffeehouse, poetry from Will's, learning from the Grecian. The Tatler was not pretending to emerge from the coffeehouses as a literary device. It was documenting in real time the geography of London's intellectual life, the way different rooms had become associated with different kinds of knowledge, and the way that knowledge circulated between them. Joseph Addison joined Steele in 1711 to produce The Spectator, which ran daily for nearly 2 years and reached an estimated readership of tens of thousands, extraordinary for the period, because each copy was read aloud in the coffeehouses to audiences far larger than the print run suggested. The Spectator's explicit project was the dissemination of Enlightenment values, reason, politeness, the examined life, to an audience that included not just the learned, but the commercially prosperous, the professionally ambitious, the merely curious. It was, in essence, the coffeehouse conversation made permanent and portable. The argument that had been happening in the rooms daily for 60 years, written down and sent out into the world. Addison understood precisely what he was doing. He wrote in one of the Spectator's early issues that he wanted to bring philosophy out of the universities and the studies of scholars and into the coffeehouses and drawing rooms of ordinary life. He wanted, as he put it, to make the learned world and the conversable world one and the same. He was describing as an aspiration something the coffeehouses had already been doing for decades as simple practice. The Spectator was the theory of an experiment that had long since been running. The information that moved through this network was not only domestic. A cloth merchant named Samuel Shepherd, not famous, not remembered, one of thousands of his kind, kept a detailed record of his commercial decisions in the first decade of the 18th century. The record survives, and what it shows is a man making judgment calls about markets in Lisbon, Hamburg, Syren, Smyrna based on intelligence he received, processed, and acted on within days of its arrival in London. He notes in one entry that news from a Lloyd's correspondent about a Portuguese embargo had reached him at the coffeehouse on a Tuesday morning, that he had discussed its implications with 2 other merchants at the same table, and that by Thursday he had adjusted his position in a cargo bond accordingly, avoiding a loss that, he calculated afterward, would have been significant. Shepherd did not think of himself as operating an intelligence network. He thought of himself as going to the coffeehouse, but the coffeehouse was the intelligence network, the mechanism by which information that had originated in a Portuguese port, traveled by ship and courier to London, been received by Lloyd's correspondent, transcribed, distributed, pinned to a wall, read by a merchant, and argued over at a communal table, became a commercial decision that affected the flow of goods across 3 countries. London, in 1700, was the center of a trading empire that reached from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, and the coffeehouses were where that empire's intelligence was processed. A merchant at Lloyd's received reports from correspondents in Lisbon, Amsterdam, Hamburg, Livorno, Smyrna, Bombay. A trader at Jonathan's tracked the performance of the East India Company against intelligence that arrived, filtered through multiple hands from Calcutta and Madras. A reader at any of a dozen coffeehouses could follow, with a currency and specificity that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. The progress of wars being fought in the Spanish Netherlands, the political situation in the Ottoman court, the state of the harvest in the Baltic grain ports whose output determined the price of bread in London. England's merchants in this period made better decisions than their counterparts in other trading nations, not because they were more intelligent, but because they were better informed. The Coffeehouse Information Network gave them a systematic, structural advantage in the processing of commercial intelligence that translated over decades into the dominance of English trading houses in the markets of the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Empire runs on information. England's empire, in its formative decades, ran substantially on the information that flowed through the coffeehouses of London. But the network had a quality that pure commercial intelligence networks do not usually have, and it is this quality that made it ultimately more than a tool of commerce. It was promiscuous. The same room that carried the shipping intelligence that let Lloyd's underwriters price maritime risk also carried the political pamphlet that argued for limits on royal authority. The same newsletter that reported commodity prices also reported parliamentary debates. The same table where merchants calculated the odds on an Atlantic crossing also hosted, an hour later, a natural philosopher describing the results of an experiment, or a theologian arguing about the proper interpretation of a scriptural passage, or a poet reading a new satire to an audience that included, by accident, a lawyer who recognized in the satire the legal argument he had been trying to articulate for weeks. Information in the coffeehouses did not stay in its lane. It crossed. A commercial insight became a philosophical question. A scientific result became a political argument. A political argument became a poem. A poem became a pamphlet. A pamphlet became a conversation in 100 rooms simultaneously, each conversation generating its own offshoots, its own modifications, its own new connections between ideas that had never been in the same room before. This is what made the Coffeehouse Network different from the intelligence networks of kings and merchants. Those networks were designed to carry specific kinds of information to specific people for specific purposes. The Coffeehouse Network was designed, insofar as it was designed at all, only to carry. The content was whatever the room produced. And what the room produced, now when you filled it daily with alert, curious, socially diverse men and gave them the same newspaper and the same cup, was something that no single mind could have generated alone. It was collective intelligence, genuinely collective, not the intelligence of a committee, which tends toward the average, but the intelligence of a network, which tends toward the unexpected. The coffeehouse didn't produce the best individual thinkers of the age. Oxford and Cambridge did that. What the coffeehouse produced was connections between thinkers, the surprising, generative, world-altering connections that happen only when different kinds of knowledge share a room. The network was, in this sense, the thing itself, not the carrier of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. And like all networks that achieve this kind of generative density, thus it could not sustain its own openness forever. The value it created was too great, and value in human hands tends eventually toward enclosure. The rooms were about to begin emptying, not from suppression, not from failure. From the oldest human instinct of all, once you have built something worth having, you build a wall around it. In 1762, a group of men who had been meeting informally at the Cocoa Tree Coffee House on St. James's Street decided they had outgrown the arrangement. They were wealthy. They were titled or connected to title. They were the kind of men who had, over the preceding decades, come to feel that the coffee house, with its penny admission and its open tables and its willingness to seat a ship's chandler next to a duke, was no longer quite the right setting for their particular kind of conversation. So they did what wealthy men do when a shared resource becomes too shared. They enclosed it. They formed a club. White's, which had begun as a chocolate house in 1693, had already made this transition. Brooks would follow. Boodles, the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's, which would define the social geography of elite London for the next 2 centuries, were built, almost without exception, on the bones of establishments that had once been open to anyone with a penny. The membership fee replaced the penny. The ballot replaced the open door. New members required the approval of existing ones, and a single black ball, dropped anonymously into a wooden box, was sufficient to exclude. The long communal table, where a merchant might find himself arguing with a mathematician, was replaced by smaller tables, then arranged to produce privacy rather than encounter. The newspapers were still there. The coffee, and increasingly something stronger, was still served. But the architecture of the room had been redesigned at its foundations to produce a fundamentally different social experience. It produced exclusion. Graceful, upholstered, entirely deliberate exclusion. This was not a conspiracy. No one gathered to decide that the radical openness of the coffeehouses should be dismantled. It happened the way most social change happens, gradually, through the accumulation of individual decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and produced, in aggregate, a transformation that nobody had planned and nobody announced. The merchants who had built Lloyd's into the world's preeminent insurance market wanted, by the mid-18th century, now to do business in a setting that reflected their standing. But the pressure to formalize was not only about prestige, it was about fraud. In 1769, a group of underwriters gathered at Lloyd's and found themselves sharing a table with men they did not trust. The coffeehouse had always been open. That was its genius, and now its vulnerability. Men who had no intention of honoring their commitments could sit at Lloyd's tables, underwrite policies, collect premiums, and disappear when a ship went down. The open door that had made Lloyd's generative had also made it exploitable. One of the underwriters that afternoon, his name is not recorded, which is fitting, because he was not acting as an individual, but as the representative of a collective frustration, stood up and said, in effect, that this could not continue. Within 2 years, 79 of Lloyd's most serious underwriters had moved to a new room at Pope's Head Alley, taking the name Lloyd's with them and leaving the fraudsters behind at the old address. They began keeping a register. They began requiring subscribers to sign a declaration of good faith. They built, slowly and pragmatically, the mechanisms of accountability that a penny admission room could never have sustained. The formalization was necessary. It was also, in the most precise sense, the end of something. The thing that had made Lloyd's generative, the openness, the daily collision of different kinds of maritime knowledge, the willingness to let any informed man sit down and participate, was exactly what the formalization closed off. The institution that emerged was more reliable, more accountable, more durable. It was also more closed. The two things were not coincidental. The closure was the price of the durability. The same story played out at Jonathan's, at the Royal Society, at every institution the coffeehouses had generated. Jonathan's Coffeehouse became the stock exchange in 1801. Formally constituted, membership restricted, outsiders excluded from the trading floor. The open outcry that had made the market worked precisely because anyone with relevant information could participate, and the formal exchange preserved the mechanism while eliminating the openness. It worked. It also calcified. The London Stock Exchange spent much of the 19th century as one of the most restrictive financial markets in the world, its membership tightly controlled, its practices resistant to innovation in ways that would, eventually, it cost the City of London its dominance in global finance. The Royal Society had made this transition earlier and more visibly. By the early 18th century, it had become, in practice, a society of gentlemen with scientific interests, rather than the open, meritocratic gathering of natural philosophers that its founders had imagined. Fellowship became a mark of social distinction as much as intellectual achievement. The coffeehouse had admitted anyone who paid a penny and had something worth saying. The Royal Society admitted those whom existing fellows considered worthy, a filter that, whatever its intentions, tended to reproduce the social composition of the men already inside it. Isaac Newton, as president of the Royal Society from 1703 until his death in 1727, presided over this transformation with apparent comfort. The man whose greatest work had been catalyzed by a coffeehouse argument, by Halley's willingness to travel to Cambridge and put a question that a more hierarchical culture would never have asked, spent his presidency building exactly the kind of hierarchical institution that the coffeehouse culture had made unnecessary. He feuded with Leibniz over priority. He used the society's resources to prosecute personal disputes. He turned the institution that had been built on nullius in verba, take no one's word for it, into an instrument of his own authority. This is not a condemnation of Newton. It is an observation about institutions. They begin as the solution to a problem and become, over time, the problem they were built to solve. While the institutions were closing, England was changing its drink. The tea had been available in London since the 1650s, arriving at roughly the same time as coffee through the same trading networks from the same general direction. But for the first century of its availability, tea was expensive, a luxury, something consumed in aristocratic households and nowhere else. Coffee was cheap. The coffeehouse was cheap. For 100 years, the economics were simple. If you were not wealthy, you drank coffee in a coffeehouse. If you were wealthy, you might drink tea at home, but you still went to the coffeehouse because the coffeehouse was where everything happened. The economics changed in the early 18th century, and they changed because of the East India Company. The company had been trading in tea since the 1660s, but in small quantities as a sideline to its core business in spices and textiles. And in the early decades of the 18th century, it began importing tea in industrial quantities, driving down the price, making it available to a much broader market, and simultaneously lobbying with the persistence that large commercial interests bring to bear on governments for tariff structures that made tea competitive with coffee in ways it had not previously been. By the 1730s and 1740s, tea was becoming England's domestic drink. Not the coffeehouse drink, the home drink. The drink you made in your own kitchen, in your own kettle, and consumed in your own parlor with your own family in privacy. The coffeehouse had been a public act. Tea was a private one. And as tea moved into English domestic life, it took with it the hours and the attention that had previously gone to the coffeehouse. The men still went, but they went less. And the women, who had never been admitted to the coffeehouses, found in the tea table a social form they could own. The tea party, the drawing room, the domestic gathering around a pot of tea. These were spaces where women were not merely permitted, but central. The social intelligence that had been conducting itself in the coffeehouses over coffee among men began to relocate, partially, gradually, into domestic spaces over tea, where women were present. This was not a straightforward improvement. The drawing room had its own hierarchies, its own exclusions, its own mechanisms for deciding whose voice mattered. But it was a different configuration, and as it rose, the coffeehouse, slowly, began to recede. By the second half of the 18th century, the great age of the London coffeehouse was ending. Not with a proclamation, Charles had tried that and failed. Not with a disaster or a scandal. Simply with the quiet accumulation of alternatives, the gentlemen's clubs for the wealthy, the tea table for the domestic, the formalized institutions, the stock exchange, Lloyd's, the Royal Society, for the professional. Each of these absorbed a portion of the coffeehouse's function and enclosed it, professionalized it, restricted it. What none of them preserved was the penny. The penny had been the mechanism, not a metaphor, the literal price that made the coffeehouse what it was. 1 penny meant that the room was open to a range of men wide enough to produce genuine collision, genuine encounter between different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of experience. The gentlemen's clubs charged guineas, and at the stock exchange charged membership fees. The Royal Society charged fellowship dues. Each of these prices was, in its way, a decision about who belonged and who did not. Each of them drew the circle of participation smaller than the penny had drawn it. The institutions the coffeehouses built survived. The openness that built them did not. And here's the reversal that history tends to obscure. The coffeehouses were not replaced by something better. They were replaced by the things they had made. And those things, in becoming permanent, in acquiring buildings and charters and membership fees and procedures, shed precisely the quality that had made them generative. The Enlightenment did not outgrow the coffeehouse. It forgot it. It built marble monuments to the ideas that had been born in smoky rooms and then quietly locked the doors of those rooms and told itself that the ideas had always lived in marble. They had not. They had lived in the penny, in the noise, in the man at the end of the table who had not been invited but had paid his coin and had something worth saying. When he could no longer afford the door, the room changed, and the world, in ways too slow and too diffuse to feel like loss, changed with it. The rooms are gone now, not all of them. A handful of the buildings survive, repurposed, their original function legible only to the historian who knows where to look. The Jamaica Wine House on St. Michael's Alley in Cornhill stands on the site of Pasqua Rosé's original shed, where London's first coffee was sold in 1652. You can drink there today. The room is darker than it was, quieter, the newspapers replaced by a menu, the long communal tables replaced by booths. Nobody is arguing about the orbit of Jupiter. Nobody is wrong about the devaluation of silver or right about it in ways that will matter to anyone else in the room. The argument moved. It moved into the institutions the coffeehouses built, and those institutions formalized it, professionalized it, built walls around it, and called the result progress. In many ways, it was. Lloyd's of London has paid claims on disasters that would have bankrupted nations: the San Francisco earthquake, the Titanic, the September 11th attacks. The London Stock Exchange has channeled capital toward enterprises that have genuinely changed the conditions of human life. The Royal Society has published, in the 3.5 centuries since its founding, some of the most consequential scientific work in human history. These are real achievements. They deserve their marble. But marble is cold. And the thing that was lost when the penny was replaced by the membership fee, the thing that no institution has fully recovered in the 3 centuries since the coffeehouses closed, was not a luxury. It was the mechanism itself. Follow the line forward and see where it goes. The French had their salons, the drawing rooms of educated women who gathered philosophers and scientists and writers and made the conversation happen. The salons were brilliant. They were also, by design, curated. The hostess decided who entered. The conversation was elevated, but it was elevated in the way that a garden is elevated, tended, shaped, and with the weeds removed in advance. The accidental collision that the coffeehouse produced, the merchant interrupting the natural philosopher, the ship captain's observation cracking open the argument that 2 scholars had been having for months. The salon could not generate this. It was too careful, too designed. The universities tried, the seminar room, the common room, the interdisciplinary research center. All of these are attempts, in their different ways, to recreate the conditions that the coffeehouse provided accidentally. They work sometimes. When they work, it is usually because someone has had the wisdom to lower the barriers, to invite the person who doesn't obviously belong, to let the conversation go where it wants, rather than where the syllabus points. When they fail, and it is usually because the institution has reasserted itself, because the membership has closed, because the penny has been replaced by a credential that not everyone can afford. The internet arrived and everyone said, "This is it. This is the new coffeehouse." Open, cheap, radically democratic, available to anyone with access to a connection, and in its early years it was, genuinely, something like this. The forums and the mailing lists and the early blogs had the texture of the coffeehouse, the sense of a room where anyone could walk in and say something worth hearing, where the argument was its own authority and the person making it was secondary to the quality of the thought. And then the internet did what the coffeehouses did. It generated value. Enormous, almost incomprehensible value. The companies it produced, as the markets it created, the institutions it built. And as the value accumulated, the enclosure followed. The open forums became platforms. The platforms became corporations. The corporations built algorithms that decided more efficiently than any ballot box, whose voice reached how many people and on what terms. The penny became the attention that you paid with your time and your data, and the men who collected that attention became, in a generation, among the wealthiest human beings who had ever lived. The coffeehouse lasted a century before the enclosure came. The internet lasted about 20 years. This is the pattern. Not a conspiracy, not a failure of individual virtue, a pattern. A structural feature of how human beings relate to open systems. Open systems generate value by lowering the barriers to participation. The lower the barrier, the wider the range of participants. The wider the range of participants, the greater the diversity of knowledge and experience in the room. The greater the diversity, the more frequent the unexpected collision. The merchant and the philosopher, the ship captain and the scientist, the idea from one domain solving the problem in another. These collisions produce the value. The value attracts people who want to capture it. Capturing it requires building walls. The walls raise the barriers. The barriers narrow the range of participants. The diversity decreases. The collisions become less frequent. The system that was generative becomes extractive. It lives off the intellectual capital that the open phase accumulated, rather than generating new capital of its own. Every institution in human history that has mattered has followed some version of this arc. The coffeehouse made it visible in a century. The internet made it visible in 2 decades. The next open system, whatever it is, wherever it emerges, will make it visible faster still because the mechanisms of enclosure are now highly developed and the men who deploy them are very practiced. The question that the coffeehouses pose 300 years after the last of them emptied is not historical. It is not about the past. It is the most urgent question in the architecture of human knowledge. How do you keep the penny? How do you build something open enough to generate the collisions that produce genuine thinking and prevent, or at least delay, the enclosure that follows from the value those collisions create? The coffeehouse did not solve this problem. It simply demonstrated it with unusual clarity in a single century, in a single city, over a cup of something bitter and cheap. There is a man. There is always a man in this story, though we have seen there should have been more. Sitting in a coffeehouse in London in 1700, he is nobody in particular. He has not yet done the thing that will make him worth remembering if he ever does it. He is a merchant, perhaps, or a physician, or a young lawyer with opinions that exceed his experience, or a natural philosopher with a half-formed idea that he cannot quite articulate. He has paid his penny. He has his cup. The room around him is loud with other men's certainties, and he is about to add his own, and someone at the other end of the table is about to challenge him. Wherein the challenge is going to require him to think more carefully than he has thought before about something he believed he already understood. He does not know that the institution he takes for granted, this noisy, smoky, penny admission room, is temporary. He does not know that within 50 years it will begin to empty, that the clubs and the exchanges and the learned societies will absorb its function and enclose its openness and charge more than a penny for the privilege of participation. He does not know that the argument he is about to have in this room with these men is part of a chain of arguments that will produce the Royal Society and Lloyd's of London and the London Stock Exchange, and the Principia Mathematica, and the political philosophy that will eventually underwrite the American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. He knows none of this. He knows only that the coffee is still hot, and the argument is still open, and the man at the other end of the table is wrong about something important, and there is still time, to set the record straight. The penny bought all of it. The insurance markets that protect the cargo moving through every port in the world. The stock exchanges that price the capital that builds the infrastructure of modern life. The scientific method, the peer review, the open publication of results, the whole apparatus of knowledge production that has produced every technology you are using right now to watch or listen to these words. The political philosophy of individual rights and limited government that underlies every democratic constitution on earth. The newspapers, the public sphere, the idea that ordinary people have a right to know what their government is doing and a right to say what they think about it. All of it, or enough of it to matter, traces a line back to a room. A cheap room in a city that was not yet the center of the world, but was becoming it, where men paid a penny and sat down and argued and were wrong and were corrected and argued again, and where the coffee kept them awake long enough to follow the argument wherever it led. The world was not built by geniuses working alone in silence. It was built in rooms, specific rooms, with specific smells and specific noises and specific conditions that made the thinking happen in ways it could not happen anywhere else. The genius was real. But genius needs a room. It needs the right room, open, cheap, full of people who don't know they're not supposed to interrupt, who don't know that the man they're correcting will be famous, who don't know that the argument they're having over a penny cup of coffee will, in ways none of them can see, change everything. The coffeehouses were that room. For 1 century, in one city, before the enclosure came and the marble went up and the doors were locked to anyone who couldn't afford more than a penny, they were that room. We have been looking for them ever since.